Hi, and welcome back to Broken and Brilliant. I'm Carrie O'Toole with Carrie O'Toole Ministries, and I have a special guest with me here via Skype. I want to welcome Jacque Watkins. Hi, Jacque.
Hi, Carrie. So glad to join you.
Well, it's so great to have you here. We're just going to pretend that we're sitting right here across from each other having coffee. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
So welcome to my little coaching room or your living room or wherever you want to pretend we are.
Okay, great.
Well, Jacque, we actually don't really know each other that well. We met through Shannon Etheridge, who kind of coaches both of us. How did you come in contact with Shannon?
Well, that's a funny story. Shannon and I, well, of course I knew Shannon from her books. That's how I originally met Shannon. And I know for me, when I read a book, I really feel like I get to know the author so well.
Yeah, they put themselves out there.
Right. It's one of my favorite things about reading books, getting to know who the author is. And so when I was in a place where I was asked to lead a women's Bible study one summer, I think it was back in 2010, I went to Barnes & Noble in search of a book. And it's then when I found Shannon's book, Every Woman's Battle. And so that summer I went ahead and led those women through that book, and also Julie Slattery's book, No More Headaches. And we were just all changed by her words, and she met me in such a real place, in the need that I had at the time.
Right.
And so it had always been a dream of mine to connect with Shannon. I had noticed her Blast mentoring program online, but hadn't had the opportunity to participate. And so I attended the Illume conference, which is a blogging conference, a couple of years ago. When Shannon held this contest, she decided that she was going to sponsor one conference attendee to participate in the Blast program. Yeah, I found it on Twitter. She had tweeted about it, and so I went ahead and entered that raffle. And, you know, to God's goodness and sovereignty, He just always knows exactly what we need. It was like a kiss from God that I actually won that contest, because I got the chance to enter the Blast program with Shannon, and we just completed it this last spring. And it was just so fun to connect with her, not only through her books, but then personally, through the coaching and mentoring that she provides in the Blast program. And I just had a wonderful time getting to know her personally, and I'm looking forward to meeting her soon in person in Texas. And so, Shannon is just, I just can't thank God enough for who she is and where her words met me.
Absolutely. I can so relate. And just for those who don't know, BLAST stands for Building Leaders, Authors, Speakers, and Teachers.
Yes.
And it's a year-long mentorship program that Shannon has put together to help anybody who has a story that they want to share. And whether you want to share it through teaching or through speaking or through writing a book or something like that, she kind of helps you figure out how to do that. And she's been instrumental in helping me get my ministry going and the podcasts and all of that stuff too. Yeah. So it's great. And then she ended up just connecting us through email saying,
yes,
hey, Jacque, meet Carrie, Carrie, meet Jacque. It's like, okay, why? But I found out that you have a story. And my podcasts are all about, they're called Broken and Brilliant, and they're all about talking to people who have been through something in their lives that just broke them or made them feel totally broken. You know, it wasn't even something maybe that they did. Sometimes it is, but sometimes things just happen to us. And when you're going through something like that, you can feel just totally alone and isolated. And like you're the only one, and you're never going to get through it. You're never going to come out on the other side. And I heard a little bit about your story and thought you would be a great guest to bring on. So do you mind just sharing some of your story with us?
Well, my story really is a hard one. It's been a hard one to share. And it actually took me over a decade to really publicly share my story. But God is even good in that He is patient with us and walks with us through our healing process, whatever our stories are. And I think you're so right that our stories are so very powerful, not only to help us heal, but telling them helps others not feel alone. And we are healed in the process of that.
Yes.
So I love what you're doing, and I'd be more than happy to share my story with
Well,
you.
thank you.
Well, my husband Thad and I, we've been married now 14 years this year, and we have 4 kids, and we met doing musical theater production at a church. And it was an immediate connection. It was a connection that caught me by surprise. But the problem was, at the time, we were both married to other people. And what seems like it's a beautiful love story ends up being a terrible sin story. And it took a long time to be willing to share that publicly, because it wasn't a story that ends up having a pretty red bow wrapped on the top, so to speak. And a story that I was concerned in sharing would give others an impression that doing things that are wrong are okay. And so it's been a journey, but it really has been wonderful to be brave enough to share the story, because I've received so many emails and so many messages from women and men who are hurting in the same place I was. And so that's why I love sharing, because others can know that they are not alone. Because there was a moment, many moments, where I did feel completely alone, and I was certain that I was the only one in this situation. So,
right.
We don't wake up one day and just decide to do what we know is not right. It's a million tiny decisions, one after another, that lead us to a place where we never thought we would end up.
So how did that process happen for you?
Yeah, well, I married my high school sweetheart when I was 21. We were both virgins. We were going to be going into ministry, and the world was just vast and big, and I was convinced I was riding off into the sunset with Prince Charming. We had had a wonderful dating relationship. Our parents had both been married for 25 years, and I honestly really didn't think marriage would be very hard. I had been a people-pleasing girl all my life, firstborn, so I was very perfectionistic and idealistic. And I just really thought I just had it all together. And I was ready to do this married thing and experience the joy of sex that I had waited for so very long. And it didn't take me long to realize that marriage was really hard. And I had not really realized that it was hard.
What were some of the things that were hard? Just for those who are young and maybe thinking about getting married, or they're in their first couple of years, what were the things that you experienced that were so difficult?
Well, I think the first thing is men and women are so different. I just assumed I was marrying someone like myself. Somebody who liked to talk and communicate and have affection. And I came from a very loud family where we just talk and interact, and we're all extroverts. And for me, having a conversation that's kind of loud and intense, to me, is just a conversation. But our families of origins were so different. He was from a pastor's family, very refined and dignified, and they communicated in a more calm and peaceful style. And so our communication styles were a little shocking. I'm not sure why that wasn't apparent to me during the 3 years of dating, but something changes when you're day in, day out, and you're living together and you're married. It's just a different dynamic. And so our families of origin were different. The way we communicated was different. Men and women have different needs. He wanted to do mountain biking and boogie boarding and all kinds of outside things, and we had been so busy in our dating and college relationship, those things hadn't really been available to participate in. I wanted to talk things through, and how are you feeling, and let's spend time at a restaurant. Just expectations were so different. And so in my immaturity, I just really thought, well, if you're not going to meet my needs, then why should I move towards you when maybe then you wouldn't move toward me? And so we came to sort of an impasse in a way. of who would move first. And I, in my immaturity, decided that he should move first, and I really did nothing. And so we were busy in ministry. I was finishing nursing school. I'm a registered nurse. I've worked in labor and delivery for 16 years now. But at the time I was in nursing school, we were serving on staff at a church. And, between ministry and school, and then when we had been married 3 years, my first son was born. And that changed so much. I just fell in love with this new little baby. He just enraptured me. I just I did not realize how much more love I could feel. And so I was very consumed taking care of a new baby. And as you know, babies stress marriages too.
Yeah.
So at the time that I was cast in this musical theater production, it was at a different church with a mutual college acquaintance that we knew. He was the music pastor on staff at that church, and I was cast to play the role of Mary in a Christmas production called Two from Galilee. And this was back in 1996, so it was really popular to do like musical theater productions at Christmas time or at Easter time. And so I just really threw myself into that role, imagining what Mary must have felt and what she must have gone through being ostracized by her community, being found out that she was pregnant, and Joseph and his turmoil of wondering what had she done, and yet the angel appears to him and tells him, don't be afraid, and so just the whole story when you're trying to do character analysis and you're trying to really throw yourself into a role. And so the feelings I began having toward the guy who was playing Joseph, the music pastor at the other church, really caught me by surprise, because it was very confusing to me. Was I just only in character, or were there other real feelings inside me that were beginning to develop, and it scared me?
Right.
Because I had never even thought for 1 second that when you're married, you could feel any sort of feelings toward anyone other than your spouse. I know that sounds very strange and naive, but for me, it really caught me off guard. I was just like stunned, like, oh no,
something's really wrong with me. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is so hard for us when we experience temptation or we experience situations that completely surprise us. For me, I was a pastor's wife, and so I was on stage a lot because we did music and worship. And so I felt like there was really no one I could talk to. I couldn't confide in anyone because, number one, I was embarrassed. Number two, I didn't think anyone else would ever struggle with this. And number three, I had those perfectionistic tendencies where I really thought I was supposed to be perfect. And here I was having feelings that were so far from perfect. And I really didn't know what to do. And so I just knew, well, if I do nothing, then that'll be fine. So I just got through those musical theater shows. We did 2 weekends. And at the end, I was finding myself so very sad. And it was at the end of the show, he came to give me my check, because it was a paid performance. And he shared with me that he felt like he had feelings for me. And it was like throwing gasoline on a small fire. And so what followed was, 2 years of friendship and couples friendship. I kept believing little lies that this would never amount to anything. I'm just having a conversation. We're just going to dinner. His wife is there. So the whole process was very insidious and very slow, but it moved forward from one tiny decision to another. And I'll never forget the day, we would go to lunch. I would take my 1-year-old son and we would eat lunch together, and I would tell my husband about it. And it was no big deal because we were friends.
Right.
But the problem was the motivation behind the behavior. And I remember that first lie. It was a lie of omission. It was, I told about my day that day, but I selectively edited the part about going to lunch because it started to become more frequent. And then phone calls. And then, eventually the physical part of the affair was so small compared to the enormity of the emotional connection. And I think because I had not tended to my marriage, and I had, there was a part in me that was just longing for attention and affection. And it was my own fault for not really sharing that with my husband. I think in these situations, what I tell women now is, secrecy and being alone in your situation is so very dangerous.
Right. So do you feel like if you had brought this to his attention and said, you know what, I'm struggling with some kind of strange feelings that have scared me a little bit, and I don't want to move forward in this, but I need your help because I'm struggling here. Would that have made a difference?
That would have made all the difference, Carrie. It really would have, because then the relationship would have been terminated, I think. I mean, maybe not completely, because, at the time, cell phones had just started. I mean, this was back in 1996.
Right.
So,
right.
It was all about pagers, and you had to actually be home to get a phone call, So, I don't know really what would have happened, but what I do know is that honesty is always better than lies. And the secrecy fueled the struggle even more. And so I ended up living a double life for, over 2 years. One of those years being complete physical also involvement with the affair. Because, people have emotional affairs, which sometimes I think are more dangerous than just the physical only affair. There's just so much more to deal with because your hearts are connected. And so I was living a double life, and it was just gut-wrenching. I think a lot of people think people who have affairs, they're just getting away with so much amazing fun and just
there's all this excitement. Yeah.
Right. And for me, yes, the relationship that I was developing with Thad was real, but it was surrounded by a lot of non-realities too. It was in a bubble. It was in secret, and I was having to continue to live my life, not to mention distancing myself from God, because when we willingly choose to sin, we have to distance ourselves from our relationship with God, because we know that it's not right, and we sense that it's wrong. But it was just that it was like my soul was like a dry, cracked piece of desert ground, and the attention and affection and the relationship that I found in the affair was pouring water on that and made me feel alive. And so at a certain point, saying what was happening out loud became like I was going to cut off my water supply, and I wouldn't make it through.
It felt like you would die.
It felt like I would die, and yet the double life was so hard. So what ended up happening is Thad and I knew, he knew the Lord too, and so I both decided that even though we didn't know what would happen, we decided that it would be best to tell the truth. And so it was Easter of 1999. He sat down with his wife, and I sat down with my husband in different places, and we confessed to the affair. And that just brought a whole whirlwind of change that I had suspected but never realized the pain that was ahead for me. And we separated, and we did go to counseling, both of us as couples, he and his wife, and me and my husband. The church was so gracious to connect us with some intensive counseling. We went for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, 6 hours a day. It was with another couple. It was a person who does counseling for pastors and ministry leaders who are in crisis. And I'm so thankful to him for being our counselor. All that time I learned so much, regardless of what ended up happening. I was really able, what happens when you're able to go to an intensive like that and really sit live with a person for hours on end, where there's no timer beeping at the 50-minute mark and you have to come back next week and you were just on a roll and you have to stop. I loved that part of it because for, 10 days in a row with a weekend break, we sat in his room for, 5-6 hours a day, and there was so much processing and understanding that came from that. There was another couple there who was in ministry crisis as well, so I wasn't in the hot seat all 6 of those hours a day.
Right.
But we learn from others when we're intensive counseling too.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you've experienced that.
Absolutely, and I actually run some intensives too. And one of the things that I have learned is when you have to keep coming back, people can kind of build up their defenses in between, but when you do it as an intensive, the defenses come down a little bit and they can stay down. And so you can really get in there and do that heart work and the work in the feelings area, which is where most of us were wounded, was in our feelings. And it's really hard to heal somebody when it's all done cognitively in your thinking part of your brain. So the intensives work because it bypasses that to help you get into the emotions and keep you vulnerable for a while. So it's very scary, but that's where the healing comes.
And it did for me. I returned from that trip and we did continue to go to counseling for a bit, but my heart had become so hardened. It was almost like, because I invested so much time with Thad, that it was almost like I was married to him in my heart for those few years and not in my marriage. And so my heart had become so hard that honestly I did not grasp the idea that God really could do a miracle in my marriage. And so we ended up divorcing. And divorce is something that is a soft spot in my heart because it's such a painful thing to go through. People who go through divorce, it's a ripping that isn't meant to be. And yet there was added guilt and shame for me because I actually chose it.
Right.
And I had a 3-year-old son at the time. And so in those years post-affair, Thad and I lived in different places. We continued to go to counseling. We let about a year and a half go by of time spent living independently. I actually lived with a friend and her husband, and he lived in his own place. We began our process of reconciliation with God and with those people that we had hurt, because we knew that no matter what happens, we can't leave God. And so it was very important to us to stop our physical relationship for that year before we ended up getting married to one another. Thad returned to his church board and went to one of the church board meetings and actually apologized and admitted his faults to them and asked for their forgiveness. We began to seek out all the people that we had hurt, our friends, our family. The thing about an affair, and I deal with a lot of people who write to me who have had affairs or who are in affairs, either emotionally or physically too. And there's just such a ripple effect of pain that goes out when you've had an affair. And it's something that I didn't realize when I was making those decisions to begin that relationship, that extramarital relationship.
You think it's just about you. Mm-hmm.
Right. I believed the lie that no one would ever find out, that the interactions that I had would just somehow never materialize, that I'd stay married and have my one side of my life. But this was just like caveat for me to meet an emotional need, and it just snowballed into something so much more than I really ever intended for it to. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I tell people, people don't wake up one day and just decide, I'm going to have an affair today. Right. It's one little decision after another leading you to a path that you just never thought you'd be capable of ending up. Mm-hmm. And that was certainly true for me. Mm-hmm. And so the recovery from that, and to see the widespread pain and hurt, from everyone really that knew us, even my extended family, who I hardly ever interacted with, it was just a shattering. And I think what happens is when a marriage fails, number one, it's hard for people to know who to stay connected with, the wife, the husband. it's
And they
hard.
feel like they need to choose a
They
lot of
do,
times.
and they don't, and so also it brings up issues within them of problems that they have maybe internally in their marriage that maybe they haven't spoken about with their spouse, or maybe they know about, but they're just really struggling through. And they see a marriage close to them fail with divorce, and it's I don't know if it's always conscious either, but it's this feeling they get of, oh no, that could actually happen to me.
Right.
And that's really too scary for me to even consider. So I'm going to make one of the people in the divorce situation really the good guy.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make the other one, that one was really the bad one. And so in their minds, I think they polarize the situation as a self-protective mechanism. Because what I had to come to is people were being, number one, they were being really nice to me as long as they could try to convince me to stay in my marriage. And they shared with me some of their deep pain that they'd been through and why it was so important to stay. But then when I chose not to stay, not everyone, but most of those kind niceties really went away. And I think when I didn't end up performing for that approval that I'd been so used to in my growing up life, I learned how to perform for love, not in a sense of faking it, but in a sense, if I achieved and I did well, then I felt loved because I got acceptance. And so this was my very first decision as a 27-year-old woman of making a decision for me and not based on what I was going to get as far as love or acceptance back. And it was scary, and it was hard, and it was wrong, and it was a failure, all wrapped into one. But I think it was me choosing me. I couldn't imagine that God could do a miracle in my marriage, and I wasn't willing to try. And I know God could have if I would have given him a chance. But I just didn't. And that's the shame and guilt that comes with my story, because it wasn't an accident that happened to me, and it wasn't a tragedy someone else imposed on me like I was doing with the divorce towards others. It was a choice that I willingly made to do what was wrong and continue to do what was wrong for a time. And the guilt and shame almost buried me for a series of years.
And then the judgment and the isolation that go along with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what?
Of course, I lost being a pastor's wife. So automatically, I wasn't the desired person to be friends with anymore, because I was just a failure and nobody, pretty much. And so I lost almost every relationship that I had up until to that point. There was one or two friends that stayed close to me and loved me through it. But for the most part, my history was erased, and Thad's as well.
Wow.
And of course, he lost his job. He resigned, and then went back later, a few years later, to ask for forgiveness. And in our reconciliation process, we ended up writing letters to those that we had hurt, because I think what's really important when we fail, when our story is dirty and messy because of failure, I think it's important to acknowledge our wrong and to say, look, I messed up. This was not right. This did not honor God. And while God is gracious to forgive and to restore and redeem, the consequences of our sin and our choices continue on.
And it takes some deliberate effort to deal with what happened, why it happened, the hurts that you've caused, the hurts you caused yourselves, the isolation, the abandonment, all of that kind of stuff. If you just go from one thing and jump right into another thing, this is why so many people bounce from relationship to relationship to relationship, because they never really deal with all of that heart stuff. We're out of time for this podcast, so we're leaving at a cliffhanger here because obviously this is not the end of your story.
No.
So can I invite you back to come back and share the rest of your story with us for another podcast?
Of course, I'd love that.
Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I just want to appreciate and say thank you for your vulnerability, because I can understand why this would be a story that might take you 10 years to be able to share. As you know, I have a story that's very difficult to share as well, and it took me 3 or 4 to be able to share, and I get that feeling. So you're the type of person that I really appreciate and want to bring on here, because I don't want others feeling alone. I want people to know there is life past huge mistakes and failure,
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Jackie, and we'll close this one out, and we'll see you
Okay.
next time here on
Okay,
Broken
Carrie,
and Brilliant.
thank you.
Thank you.